Welcome to this episode of The People Dividend. I'm your host, Mike Horn, and I am absolutely delighted, beyond delight, to have in our virtual studio today, Nick Jain. Nick is the CEO of IdeaScale, and you can find out more about him at ideascale.com. Nick has a story that I think is really second to none. While he has, and I'm going to let Nick relate most of his story to you. But he's in that category, I think, of authentic leadership for not everyday people, because Nick is not an everyday person, regardless of what he may tell us. I mean, Ivy League educated, a successful entrepreneur, worked at some of the big consulting firms. But I'll let Nick tell his story and what he's up to now. So Nick, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mike. So yeah, my name's Nick. I'm the CEO of IdeaScale, which makes innovation management software. So we've been around about 15 years. We have major clients, including Comcast, Coast Guard, a bunch of banks in Asia as well. And really our software is, think of it like a CRM for ideas. In terms of my own personal background, I joined IdeaScale about a year and a half ago as an external hire for CEO. I spent most of my career working in large private equity firms and hedge funds on Wall Street, but was originally actually trained as a scientist in mathematics and physics. So it kind of was a circuitous journey going from a formerly trained scientist to ultimately a business executive. And I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Well, tell me about a CRM for ideas first. I mean, I want to cross that off my list.
Sure. So let's draw the CRM analogy. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, for those of your viewers who are old enough to remember, people used to keep business cards in a Rolodex, which was a physical spinning piece of paper so that you could keep track of who your business contacts were. Sometime in the late 1990s, people said, hey, it's stupid to keep all that contact information in paper cards. Let's put it into a software system. Now, the same is happening for ideas today. If you have a great idea, how do you record it? How do you share it with your colleagues? You stick it on you write it on a 3M Post-it note, or you email a colleague or stick it on an Excel file. That is how ideas live in large organizations today. Our software takes all of those Post-it notes, all of those things in Excel ideas or Google Forms or sent via email to your colleagues and puts it in a central place where all of your colleagues can look at it. They can iterate out and say, hey, Mike's got a great idea, but if we tweak it just a little bit, it becomes an even better idea. And so all of a sudden you have an idea meritocracy where the best ideas come together in a centralized place and can be turned into reality by the heads of the organization, rather than in a typical organization where really it's the people in the corner office whose ideas get heard and get implemented. Today, it doesn't matter if you're the junior most employee sitting in a far off office. If you have a great idea with software like IdeaScale, it can get in front of the decision makers of your organization very, very quickly.
And why is this important? Why is this important for everyone? I mean, most organizations aren't highly democratic, and often many of them don't value participation. So why is all this important?
I think it's for two reasons. Number one is the notion of the best ideas aren't always in the CEO's brain or the CFO's brain, right? There's really bright people all around an organization. In fact, that's why organizations hire people, because presumably they're good at whatever they do. So the first benefit is you're able to tap into the brains and intellectual capital of your entire organization rather than just the 4, 5, 6 people who sit at the top or in the corner office. The second is from an inclusion and emotional impact perspective. If your employees feel like their ideas are being heard, they feel more attached to the organization. They're more loyal, turnover's less, and they are more productive as employees too. So there's a emotional impact to having a more democratic organization as well.
And so where does all of this take you, Nick? I mean, you'll scale this company, you'll scale this idea, you'll continue to do it. And I mean, where do you go? Where do you go from here?
Sure. So IdeaScale is in a very fortunate place where, unlike the typical technology company, we didn't take any venture capital. We're very profitable. And our owner, singular, one guy, has a very long-term vision for us. So I'm in a very fortunate situation where I get to lead a company where there's not a lot of pressure to, let's say, go IPO in 3 or 4 years or sell the company next year. And instead, I can build a company, over the next 5, 10 years. So for me, I look at this and say, hey, there's a very, very large market out there. Pretty much any large organization, government, nonprofit, private sector needs some software like ours. And the space is still very nascent. There's 5 or 10 companies that are doing similar things out of as us. But if you add all of us together, we probably only cover about 10% of the potential applicable market. So the way I see it, there's, a 10-year runway for growth where IdeaScale and our peers, candidly, can continue to grow and continue to make differences in our customers' organizations.
And so, Nick, the question that I have, and you've probably answered 100 times, is how have you ended up here? How did you end up here?
So, as I said earlier, I started my career spent most of my career in Wall Street.
Right.
And then totally randomly, about 4 or 5 years ago, I got a call from a private equity firm saying, hey, do you want to come co-run a trucking company? So I did that for a while, and then I got recruited over to run a men's shoe company. And then and at that point, I've now, run or co-run 2 companies in 2 very diverse industries. And then about 2 years ago, I totally randomly got a call from a friend of the owner of IdeaScale saying, hey, IdeaScale is looking for a new CEO. Are you interested? And for me, it was really exciting personal opportunity going from like a co-CEO or co-head of the organization to truly, just being the CEO. And in an industry that I personally love. I love software. That's actually what I spent most of my career investing in, private equity. And I think software is really impactful because it makes such a difference to organizations. It's much more scalable than, let's say, an individual. Like one individual human being, no matter how amazing they are, is limited by the number of hours in a day. Software really isn't. And so I I jumped at the opportunity to join an organization that was owned by someone with a long-term vision, and the opportunity for me to be, have the big chair and progress my career, as well as an organization where I saw a lot of runway for growth.
Right. And how is it that you make a difference? Given everything that led you to this moment?
Sure. So I think, speaking for myself as a leader, I think there's probably 2 things I bring to the table that are a bit different than, let's say, the typical executive. Number one is most of my career, I grew up on Wall Street, which means I have a very good sense for how value is created. The same approach that private equity and hedge funds use, I can use to bring and lead an organization, which is like, for example, how do you think about the ROI of business decisions, whether that be marketing or hiring or coding? And then the second is my background in science. Most people in the business world come up kind of through marketing or sales organizations or operations organizations. I was formally educated as a scientist. So I'm very, very focused on on collecting data, analyzing data, and using that to define decisions. So applying those same mathematical tools to run this organization, I think, is allowing me to make a pretty big difference here. One stat I love to quote is, over the last 18 months since I've been here, we have grown headcount 34%, whereas over that same time, the average technology company has laid off about 10 to 25% of their workforce. Mm-hmm. And that is just because we're so data driven on making the right business decisions that create value for all of our constituents, employees included.
What drove your interest in leadership and aspiring to the top chair?
Sure. So I think it's a few things. Number one is my professional goal in life is to build things. As a high school student, I used to work carpentry and construction. It was wonderful at the end of the summer to see a building being built, whether that be a mall, a house, a temple, whatever. So it's really satisfying to build something, and I'm trying to do that at a higher scale. That's what's emotionally rewarding to me, to build a company. Number two is I think I do bring something a little bit different than the typical executive. And I think where I have value, I should bring it, to the benefit of society or this company. And then thirdly is just, I'm a competitive guy. I like the idea that, hey, I'm running a company and that I'm able to build a company more successfully than some of the other organizations out there or some of the other people out there.
It's interesting. I don't run across a lot of folks with whom I work that describe themselves as competitive, though many others might label themselves as competitive. That fits into your persona somehow. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. So look, part of, being a leader requires being self-aware of, what your strengths and weaknesses are. I'm a competitive individual. I like to go out there, define a goal and win, particularly in a competitive space where there's other people trying to achieve the same thing. That has certainly been a defining characteristic. I was an athlete throughout high school and college. I was aspiring to do, very well academically when in college and business school. I play poker semi-competitively. This is a core part of my personality, not just from a professional perspective, but also just something that gives me joy. By the way, I don't have to win. Obviously, winning feels nice, but just the act of competing is really motivating and emotionally rewarding for me.
I find that most of the people that I work with are goal-oriented, or the people I most enjoy working with, scientists, engineering leaders, STEM leaders, not so many mathematicians. Actuaries tend to be a different set of folks. But I enjoy working with goal-directed, goal-oriented people. What drives that in you?
I'd say it's two things. One is it's nice to know the impact of something, right? So one of the things that you learn, in any of the STEM fields, whether it be engineering or physics or math, is there's right and wrong answers. There's a definition. You don't just get to the finish line or the end of it, something, and the result is ambiguous. And having clarity of, hey, we won, we lost, we did a good job, we did a bad job, is something that I think is really deeply intrinsic to kind of who I am as a person. Right. It's one of the reasons why I pursued the sciences. It was nice to know, hey, I got this problem right or I got it wrong. And if I got it wrong, it's an opportunity to learn. Business in many ways, the same thing. The private sector, obviously, if you're growing your company, if you're profitable, if you're creating value for your shareholders, your employees, your customers, you can say that, hey, I've succeeded, or conversely, I failed. And that's just truly intrinsic to who I am as a person.
I get a lot of calls, prospect calls from people at big companies, Google, Apple, any of those places where many people would believe they would enjoy working. And often the people that call me from those organizations are at the director level or senior director level, and they want to move into a VP role or, eventually into the C-suite role. Can you talk a little bit about that? In relationship to goals, is that an enviable goal? To have at, a stage in career, people are in their 40s, thinking about next steps, thinking about advancement. Is that a goal in and of itself? What do you think about that, Nick Jayne?
So for me, it was, but I don't think I quite appreciated what it took till I was here. Throughout my career in private equity, for example, I was advising the CEOs. I was very senior and influential, but I didn't ultimately have the responsibility. Now, having sat in the CEO or co-CEO chair a couple of times, I think there's two or three things that, I would have loved to have told my younger self. Number one is the moral responsibility that sits on me. So I have 100 employees and 500, when you include the family members of those employees, I have 500 people's livelihoods depending on me. So I have to be very thoughtful about the fact that, hey, if I make a bad decision today and we end up having to do layoffs in 6 months or 18 months, that's, 20, 30, 100 people's lives I've impacted. That truly weighs on me. And I'm not saying that, jokingly, I've literally lost nights of sleep saying, hey, will this decision have a negative impact? Have I de-risked or thought through it carefully enough? Because that moral responsibility depends on you. Second is kind of the willingness to make unpopular decisions, which there's a lot of things I constantly get pressure from inside the organization, let's say to invest in this part of sales or to do something in engineering. And I sometimes have to say no. And that is something I think I have learned was a little bit more difficult to do consistently, and know that, somebody dislikes you or, hated your decision over and over, even though, deep down it's the right decision. It's not a matter of kind of intellectually right or wrong. It's a matter of emotional impact. So going back to your question about whether it's enviable, look, if you want to make the big decision, certainly one should aspire to a C-level job, whether that be in government or nonprofit or the private sector. But I do think you have to be aware, assuming you are a reasonably moral and diligent person, you have to be aware of the moral weight and the emotional impact of having that job, which certainly I underappreciated until I got here.
It's interesting, I because I work with successful people for the most part. This morning, a venture capitalist was interviewing me. He's interested in coaching, and I thought this guy has a lot of luxuries in life. He's able to take 3 months off, go sit on the beach in Hawaii, think about, next steps, call a guy like me, wanting to spend some months, thinking through the next steps. And all of those things are present. I think some sense of moral responsibility, some, need to make the world better, to be unpopular. When what I talked with him about today was being able to face a lot of rejection, and what do you do with that rejection? And I wonder, in your experience, being around similar people, would you say that there is a relationship to the kind of traits that you just described around moral responsibility, tough decision making? I get the tough decision making. I think, you got to have a tough skin as a leader.
Look, I have throughout my career, my career, I have found that there's some people who, have more responsibility to a broader constituent base and lose sleep over their decisions, and how those decisions impact other people, and others don't. So I don't think it's intrinsic to the role. I think there's successful CEOs or presidents or, politicians who don't care about the impact of their people on other people, and those who do. So I would not say it's intrinsic to the role, or it's necessarily you learn that skill when you get here. I think it's truly intrinsic to the person. And for better or worse, you can be successful in this role without having that sense of moral obligation.
Ooh. Where's trust enter into all of this? I used to spend a lot of time talking about authentic leadership. My last book was Working and Living Authentically. And because of authentic leadership, we talk a lot about trust. Without trust, you really can't think about integrity. If a person doesn't think you have integrity, they certainly won't trust you. Where's that enter into the world of Wall Street and the world of executives? Where do you think that enters in?
Sure. So I would say it's in different ways. In Wall Street, you're managing other people's money. Generally, they're not going to, there's all these laws to protect Wall Streeters from stealing money. But at the end of the day, when you hand somebody, your life savings or a pension fund may hand thousands of people's life savings, you are at the end of the day putting a huge amount of trust in the individual. So a lot of money gets moved around on Wall Street, ultimately based on human trust, because at the end of the day, no matter what the regulations are, someone can find a way around them. So you have to believe in the ethics of the person on the other side. I think in an operational role, it's a bit different. And I'll use an example at IdeaScale. So I joined IdeaScale about 1.5 years ago. And I think for the first year or so, people understood intellectually why I was making certain decisions or guiding the organization a certain way. But candidly, I hadn't built trust with some of the senior leaders in the organization until about a year ago, until about a year into the job. So it took a long time to build trust and build an emotional level. For others to trust me, I should say, despite them intellectually acknowledging that the decisions I was making were right decisions. And so that was quite a bit of a journey, candidly, and much longer than I expected, because intuitively to me, if someone's consistently making the right decisions for 3-6 months, you should begin to trust them. But it took a lot longer, and candidly, I still have some people around the organizations that I need to build an emotional connection and bond with that extends beyond just the intellectual bond.
Some of my clients, many of my clients, are often the smartest person at the table. I don't think they would say that out loud, but because of their achievements, because of the innovations they've brought in science or technology, they're pretty doggone smart people. And it's not uncommon among these folks to think about many of the others around them as morons, as idiots. And sometimes they get in trouble for that. And that's why they end up with me, because the head of HR is tired of dealing with the grief or with the complaints. But deep down inside, I think in some ways that, they do believe that. And that's not to say that, that they're acting out of that because they believe they're the smartest person at the table. Maybe it's they don't have time. They don't have patience. You're a smart guy, Nick. Where's that all figure in for you? I mean,
Sure.
in terms of how you think about
I've
that.
got two. Yeah. So look, I think I'm a pretty smart guy, but I have domains of expertise. If you were to engage me on abstract mathematics or physics, I'm going to hold my own very strongly. There's areas where I'm very weak or not very strong. So here's a very tactical example from IdeaScale. IdeaScale is a technology company. More than half my employees are software engineers, and I am not an engineer. I can code as well as, some 9-year-olds, basically. Maybe a little bit better than that. But that means that a lot of what is going on in my technology practice, my head of engineers is definitely way, way smarter than me in terms of coding and software engineering. But even the junior most employees, guys who are a year out of college, those engineers are much better than me.
Sure.
And know
absolutely.
stuff, words that I don't even know. So it's humbling from an emotional point of view. But B, I ultimately have to trust all those employees from the senior most employee down to the junior most employee because they have domain expertise where they're using words that sometimes I don't even understand. And then thirdly, there's that joke, trust but verify. So I trust everything that folks are saying, but then it requires a lot of homework. So when someone says a word that I don't understand or references a topic, I jot that down and have to go learn about it. I'll never be as good at them as it, but I need to have enough knowledge of the new topics they're introducing me to learn. And that is not just true for engineering. My head of sales has been selling for 10, 15 years. He's a better salesperson and mentor to junior salespeople than I am. So there's a lot of domains of expertise within my company where I can honest to goodness say, hey, not just the senior most employees, but also some of the junior most employees in that division are just much, much better than me. And that's a reality I live with every day in my job. And I should have to live with because if I was
Do you think that these skills around being polite, I don't mean about being respectful, I think that's different, but about being polite, treating others with respect, acknowledging people not only as not just as an element of production. Do you think these skills are innate or are they developed?
I think they're developed, candidly.
Yeah.
I'll give two examples. So I grew up in Canada. Well, I grew up in a mix of Canada and India. Canadians are obviously known for their, absurd level of politeness. So I was taught to say please and sorry in front, in most situations. You bump into someone, I instinctively say sorry because that was just so deeply ingrained as a Canadian. And then conversely, coming from my family coming from India and actually having grown up there for several years as well, there's a deep level of respect in Indian society where you respect somebody because their title or their age age is a good example. So if there's an older gentleman, even if he's my employee, I'll still, in Hindi, I would still use the honorifics to acknowledge that he's, I would respect the fact that he's older. That's just built into the language. So that is learned behaviors, learned through family, through culture, through country, rather than innate, in my opinion.
And then what do you do to develop these skills? I mean, other than childhood experiences and, or you just sort of take them for granted?
So I'm in a fortunate position where I guess I take them for granted. But I would say if you want to learn these skills, I would assert that you need to believe other people are worthy of respect. Because if you ultimately and innately believe others aren't worthy of respect because you think you're the smartest person or the most attractive or the greatest athlete or whatever, if you believe other people are less than you, you're never going to have the desire to treat them with respect. Yes. I fortunately, was raised, everyone is worthy of respect as a human being, in my opinion.
Good value. Do you think it's easy for smart people, and you've been around a lot of smart people, Nick, to develop their downsides, their flat sides, easy to talk about them? Maybe it's not easy for anyone, but what do you think about developing them? Because success often rewards success, right? I think about an old book by Alfie Kohn called Punished by Rewards. Most of the people, again, that I'm familiar with, they've been leading their entire lives, whether it was in Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, some, sports team here or there. I mean, they've had sustained, people telling them, oh, you've got, certain leadership skills or certain leadership qualities. And that gets reinforced over a lifetime. So where's the connection to improvement, to development, to more personal growth that might lead to greater abundance?
Well, it depends if you want that in life, right? So I would say, the two terms that people have used in my career as part of development processes are either you're well-rounded, wherever you have no, major deficits, or you are spiky. So you may be extraordinary at, let's say, you're a deeply empathetic person. You may be a little weaker at math, not critically weak, but your skill is empathy, or conversely, it could be in analytics or whatever. I would say that, first of all, it's okay to not be a well-rounded person. Not everybody wants to be a well-rounded person or be a well-spiked person. Conversely, other people may say, hey, I just want to be good at this one thing in life. I want to be the best in the world. And I'm okay if I'm so focused on developing this one characteristic of my life that I have a deficit in others. So if all I do is play, basketball each day, and I'm terrible at basketball, I could make a life decision that I want to be the world's best basketball player. But as a consequence of that, I may underinvest in my relationships. I may underinvest in my career. I may underinvest in, education. That's my choice. And lots of people make different choices in terms of where they want to invest in themselves based on what emotionally rewards them or their goals in life.
Let's talk about the roles of judge and coach, or judging and coaching, and where those roles play out as a CEO. How do you think about those two concepts?
Sure. So I'll break them out. For judging at IdeaScale is actually really easy. We focus, all of our decisions are made using a return on investment or ROI framework. So the judge is math. So if you and I have a difference of opinion, you can be the junior most employee or the senior most employee. We will put our math down, our ROI math down on a piece of paper, and the math decides. So this happens actually really frequently at IdeaScale, where I put forward an idea and a junior person puts forward an idea, but their idea has a better math. It has better ROI. And so the ROI wins. It is not Nick as CEO wins. It is not, John as a senior person wins. It's the math is the judge and the jury, not title. And that's something that's really, really important to our organization's culture and how we make decisions. In terms of mentoring, I think mentoring and coaching, I think there's two things I would say. Number one is the counterparty has to be interested or willing to be coached, number one. And number two, the person coaching has to have some greater skill in some area than the person being coached. So if I am not particularly good at running a factory, it would probably be a poor decision for me to try and coach someone on how to run a factory. In fact, that's a good example. I actually have no idea how to run a factory, so I certainly should not be trying to coach somebody on that skill set.
And as you think about that, though, more broadly or perhaps differently, as opposed to an application of running a factory, but to put it into the human experience, the human element, what would you say there in terms of perhaps, encouraging a person to adopt more humanistic values, or encouraging someone to be a better listener, or to be more receptive to feedback? I mean, how would you think about that?
Sure. So I personally am very, very careful about giving kind of soft feedback because I feel in some ways soft feedback is being critical of who somebody is as a human being. If they are loud speakers, or if they are abrupt, or a little callous, that is in some ways innate to their personality. And I certainly don't want to say, hey, you're a bad person. The things that I do focus on the softer, the few things that I try and focus on the softer side are how people communicate, either explicitly through their language or implicitly through their body language, or through their writing, for example. So the softer humanistic coaching that I tend to give tends to be around, hey, how do you as an employee or as a subordinate or as a manager or a peer or my boss communicate more effectively with people throughout the organization so that you can be heard better and have a greater impact on whatever you're trying to do?
This is by asking a question and thinking about that. I'm a big believer, as my mentors, Charlie and Edie Seashore, taught me, is that feedback often says more about the giver than it does the receiver. And how you think about that, and that causes me to consider the best way to get feedback is to build a relationship with someone. to ask some questions, because then you learn more about the other person and can work through periods of adjustment so that you get more out of that relationship altogether. And Nick, if you were to, Nick Jain is the CEO of IdeaScale, and if you were to, think about one or two ways that you're interested and will continue to develop your company, develop your team, maybe those are two different questions. What would those be?
As an individual or from the company's perspective?
Both.
Okay. So as an individual, look, I'm aware that I have certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and some of those have stayed constant. My weaknesses in particular have stayed more or less constant through my career, although I've gotten better. So I would say for me personally, I have 2 or 3 weaknesses that are well identified that I want to continue to improve on. Now, I know, given who I am as a person, that I will never be world-class at those weaknesses, but I don't want them to be deficits because they will negatively impact either my peers or my organization over time, especially if I'm in a leadership role. That's how I would kind of focus on myself. For IdeaScale, I would say, look, we're in a really fortunate position where we're growing, we're profitable in a time where a lot of other technology companies are struggling. So I think that's due to us making good decisions. And the goal is now, as we continue to scale, how do we maintain that same culture of making good decisions as we grow from a 100-person organization to a 1,000-person organization?
So interesting. I think about some of the successful leaders and entrepreneurs that I've worked with who have had that same question about, as people ask them, well, what happens to our culture when we grow to 100 people? What happens when we get to 2,000 people? What happens when we get to 5,000 people? Culture evolves, culture changes. And yet there are probably some ways to hold certain elements at the center or at the core. And that, I suspect, requires a great deal of resolve, but also an amount of curiosity about where that organization is headed. And that's why I think it's helpful, to think less about culture today and more about community and how we build communities at work. And I wonder how you might think about that or how you might consider that, Nick.
Sure. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. At some level, the culture will inevitably change as we've continued to grow. The company a year and a half ago was 30-40% smaller than it is today in terms of people. So it's evolved. I think there's 2 things that we're trying to do really very explicitly in order to maintain a culture or community. Number one is every single new employee in the company that joins, I personally sit down and have a half hour just social chat with them. We're a distributed organization with people in 6 or 7 countries now, but no matter where they are, no matter what their title is, no matter what their age is, I sit down and have a 30-minute chat with them. That's number one. Number 2 is pretty much we're an incredibly flat organization. So we're all on Slack all day. And 95% of the information throughout the organization is public. Anybody can Slack me or any other person around the organization. It is not unusual, in fact, for me to be personally helping a recent employee in South Africa or a junior engineer in Dhaka, Bangladesh. That's a normal part of our culture, not just me reaching out to them, but them reaching out to me and saying, hey, Nick, I noticed something wrong here, or here's an idea. And that's not unique to me. I think IdeaScale, my predecessor, Rob, who founded this company, did a really good job of building a very flat culture. And I'm trying to maintain that even as we continue to grow.
That's great. Hey, Nick, and as we begin to wrap up in the last few minutes, if you were to offer some advice or some guidance to aspiring leaders, what 2 or 3 things would you say to them?
Sure. I would say 3 things. Number 1, read a lot. Whatever it is, whether that be fiction, whether that be, newspapers, whether that be or technical journals in your field, read an insane amount. This ties into my second point, which is always be upskilling. The skills that matter today are very different than, 5 years ago. For example, over the last year and a half, everyone's talked about Jet AI. That was a skill set that if you're not mastering right now, candidly, you may not have the opportunity to lead an organization or even be employed in 5 or 10 years, because that is such a valuable skill set that didn't even exist 5 or 10 years ago. And then thirdly, I think, and this may be a little biased here, but data analytics and mathematics are becoming increasingly important. The analogy is like Wall Street. Wall Street, if you think back in the Wolf of Wall Street days, was a bunch about intuition and aggression, whereas modern Wall Street is really run by a bunch of quants. And that is increasingly happening in the world of business. Whereas the next generation of leaders rises, they're much more data and analytically oriented, especially as we live in a data-rich world. So master some of those quantitative skills, even if you haven't been formally coached in them, because they're going to matter more and more over the next decade or two.
Oh, that's great. And Nick Jain is the CEO of IdeaScale. And I've really had a blast talking with you today, Nick. And I think there is so much that our listeners can take from this episode in terms of leadership, in terms of pathways, in terms of thinking about scale, not only personal scale, but organizational scale. So I'll leave a last word for you if you'd like to have one, Nick.
No, I want to just thank you, I guess, for the opportunity to be invited on your podcast. So much, thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah, thank you so much. And until the next episode of The People Dividend, stay well.